Chapter 3. Light from beyond the living world seeped through the great crystal skylight of the audience chamber, bathing the inner court with a boreal display of shifting, unsettled light. High upon a circular dais, in the centre of the vaulted room, the Drakau of Hag Graith, merciless fist of the Witch King, loomed like a nightmare before his subjects. He wore the ancient sorceress armour of his station, an intricate harness of blackened Ithelmar plates, sharpened fluted edges and cunningly forged hooks. Fiery light and bitter steam seethed from the seams in the armour and the eyes of the demon mask carved into his ornate helm. And when the Drakau moved, the joints of the armour cried like the souls of the damned. 3 freshly severed heads hung from trophy hooks at the Drakau's waist, and the heavy curved sword in his left hand steamed with clotted gore. His right hand was enclosed in an armoured gauntlet, tipped with barbed talons and carved with thousands of tiny, glowing sigils. In that clawed, vice-like grip, a high-born noble writhed in his own blood and filth, his eyes gleaming with fear and pain between the Drakau's armoured fingers. The noble saw only darkness, agonizing and absolute, but he uttered not a single sound. The pale faces of the court shone like ghosts in the chamber's unsteady light, bearing witness to the highborn's brush with ancient night and waiting for their own turn to come. This was the culmination of the Hanelkar, the presentation of tribute and the renewal of the oath of fealty to the Drakau, and through him, in turn, the Witch King. The inner court was packed with the true highborn of the city, prominent nobles rich in gold, slaves or battle honours, with hoary lineages and titles. The families clustered in discreet groups, maintaining a wary distance from rivals and even allies. Assassination attempts were a matter of course during public gatherings, especially on such ceremonial days. Every family member was further insulated by a circle of favoured retainers, leaving each high-ranking Druki lost in his own solitary thoughts. Malus watched the highborn suffer on the steps before the dais, and wished that he were the one wearing the dreadful gauntlet. The need to lash out, to slice into skin and muscle and spill sweet blood was so intense it set his teeth on edge. He could feel the eyes of his former allies upon him, those nobles who'd invested in his scheme and risked the wrath of his siblings, to say nothing of his dreaded father. They were watching him like wolves, waiting in the shadows for the right moment to sink their teeth into his throat. And they could do it. They knew exactly how weak he was. He'd broken with ancient tradition, going outside his own family for the funds and alliances, to embark on his late-season raid. Worst of all, he'd returned empty-handed. Now there was a large debt to be paid, and his father could easily disavow any obligation in the matter. The Volkar hadn't yet, but only because the Druki lords hadn't yet pressed the issue. Of course, they would when they sensed the time was right. He had little support to draw on. The survivors of the mercenary spearmen had left his service as soon as they'd reached the Hag, and Malus had been forced to pay them in full or risk a blood feud he could ill afford. That left him no more than a score of retainers, and twice that many household servants. He'd only brought 3 retainers with him to court: Lunara, Dolthake, and Arleth Van. The retainers stood in a tight semicircle behind him with their hands on their swords. It was a token guard at best, but against the massed strength of his debtors, his entire complement of warriors wouldn't have been enough. Better to keep them guessing at his display of bravado than confirm their suspicion with a phalanx of bodyguards. The children of the Volkar were arrayed in order of age and ostensible power, though gauging the relative strength of a highborn family was a murky business in the best of times. There was a conspicuous gap between the tall, armoured figure of Lurhan Fellblade and his second oldest child, Isilvar. Bruglier the Reaver, eldest son of the great warlord, was still at sea with his raiding fleet, filling his holds with plunder and the choicest slaves from Ulthuan and the Old World. He would not return until the first of the spring thaw, spending most of the year at sea. It was a feat that only a handful of Corsair lords could accomplish, and his favour with the Volcar was such that Lurhan made it plain that none of his siblings was fit to take Bruglier's place, regardless of circumstance. It also had the effect of focusing the resentment of Lurhan's other children, chiefly on Bruglier, a fact that had not escaped Malus. There were no fat Druki. Like their debased cousins, the elves of Ulthuan, the peoples of Naggaroth were typically lithe and muscular, hard and swift as whipcord. Isilvar was fleshy. His skin had the greenish pallor of the libertine, pouchy and swollen from too many years of potent spirits and mind-altering powders. He wore his black hair braided with dozens of tiny hooks and barbs, and his long, drooping moustache hung like two thin tusks past the line of his pointed chin. His long-fingered hands, with their sharpened black lacquered nails, were constantly in motion. Even when folded before him, the fingers riffled and danced like the white legs of a cave spider. Isilvar had made no raids past his own Haxir crews. Indeed, he often disdained to carry a sword in public, relying on a large contingent of lavishly appointed retainers for protection. At some point in the past, he and his elder brother had reached an agreement of sorts. Bruglier reaped a harvest of flesh and coin from the spineless kingdoms beyond Naggaroth, and Isilvar oversaw its investment at the Hag and elsewhere across the land of Chill. This kept Bruglier at sea, spilling blood, and gave Isilvar all the golden slaves to sate his prodigious appetites. At the heart of this strange arrangement were Isilvar's relentless cravings, or so the rumours went. His apartments in the Volcar's tower were said to be a charnel house, rivaling the Temple of Cain elsewhere in the city. So long as he could bathe in the blood of the tormented each and every day, he was loyal to his brother, the Provider. Isilvar was surrounded by a score of heavily armed and armoured Druki, each of them resplendent in plate armour, lacquered in shades of ruby and emerald. They formed a horseshoe-shaped formation around him, taking care not to deny their lord an unobstructed view of the excruciations occurring on the dais. Isilvar watched the agonies of the highborn with rapt attention, his eyes fever-bright, his long hands, spotted with drops of old blood, spasmed greedily at each of the supplicant's convulsions. If Isilvar wore his hunger like a rich, stained robe, Lurhan's third child wore a mask of cold, perfect marble, revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. It was said that Lurhan's long-dead wife had been a creature of stunning, lethal beauty. Stories recounted duels fought over a single passing caress offered at court, or rivals torn apart by eager young nobles who lived and died at her whim. Her daughter Yasmir was said to be her living image. Tall and effortlessly poised, lithe and muscular as one of Cain's blood-draped brides. Lurhan's eldest daughter wore a gown of indigo-coloured silk beneath a drape of delicate, yellowed finger bones bound together with a fine silver wire. Her thick, lustrous black hair was pulled back from the perfect oval of her face. She had large, violet eyes, the mark of an ancient bloodline, stretching back to drowned Naggaroth. They added an exotic air to her otherwise classical features. A pair of long, bone-handled daggers hung from a narrow girdle of Noglier hide, and it was well known that she could use them as well, or better, than any man with a sword. She was closely guarded by a dozen retainers, each one a rich and powerful son of one of the city's highborn families. Yasmir was a living, breathing treasure to them, a wealth of power, influence and beauty, seemingly ripe for the taking. Malus knew better. They were her baubles, to be toyed with and expended to suit her needs, and for the few months he was at the Hag, Yasmir and Bruglier were inseparable, taking up residence in his Spartan quarters in the Valkar's tower. So long as she held her brother's undivided attention, no other man would dare press a challenge of marriage for her. Other Druki tended to fade into the background when in the presence of Yasmir's glimmering beauty, but none more so than her younger sister. Nagaira was more the child of her brooding father. Her skin was duskier, her frame smaller, and her figure fuller and less athletic. She had Lurhan's black eyes and strong nose, and her thin lips were often compressed in a fine, determined line. Unlike her sister, Nagaira preferred robes of indigo and deep red over her lightweight chiton worked with the Cold One sigil of the Valkar's house. She wore her black hair in a thick braid that hung only to her waist. It was streaked with strands of glistening grey and white, the telltale sign of one who trafficked in dark lore. Rumours of her secret pursuits had circulated through the court for many years, but if she were troubled by the hint of scandal, she took no steps to mitigate it. Like her siblings, she was well attended, though her retainers were less a show of strength or vanity than a nod towards function and propriety. The 10 Druki that surrounded her were a motley crew, a mix of priests, rogues and mercenary swords, but she chose her tools well and knew how to use them when she put her mind to it. But if Nagaira was the shadow to Yasmir's cold radiance, Lurhan's youngest true child was a patch of deepest night. Uriel stood straight and tall, nearly of a height with his father, but the heavy black robes masked the withered right arm and bent leg that had marred him from birth. The Druki had no place in their houses for cripples. The malformed were slain at birth, or the males given as a sacrifice to the Temple of Cain. The infant Uriel had been cast into the Lord of Murder's cauldron, and if the stories were true, the ancient brass split with the thunderclap that knocked the priestesses senseless. It was not unheard of for a sacrifice to survive the seething cauldron. Such children were seen as marked by the Lord of Murder and taken in by the temple to be trained in the arts of assassination. But Uriel's body was too deformed to make him a holy warrior. He had been raised in the temple as an acolyte, though what he learned there was a mystery oft speculated. After 15 years, the maidens returned him to the Valkar's household without explanation, and since then he had occupied a tower all to himself, attended to by a handful of anonymous retainers. Half a dozen of them stood in a tight cluster behind their lord, wearing night masks of polished steel fashioned in the shape of skulls. Like their lord, they wore black robes over fine hauberks of blackened mail, and carried great curved swords in scabbards of leather and bone strapped across their backs. They were still as statues. Malus noted that they made no sound when they moved. He couldn't say for certain that they had even breathed. Uriel's skin was so pale it was almost blue, his features too gaunt to be handsome, and his long hair was almost entirely white. It was well known that the only thing that aroused the Druki's passions, besides his studies and the ceremonies of the temple, was his sister Yasmir, but it was just as well that she loathed the sight of him. For many years, Malus had expected Yasmir to take her stories of Uriel's clumsy advances to Bruglier, who would tear his malformed brother apart in a jealous rage. It had happened to other misguided suitors before, yet despite Bruglier's famous temper, the eldest son of the Valkar had never raised a hand to his youngest true brother. Uriel the Forsaken, Malus thought, cast aside by your father and vomited up from Cain's own cauldron. You make no raids, you hold no influence at court, and your retainers are faceless and few. And yet the Drakau favors you. What gifts do you place at his feet? As if sensing his stare, Uriel's head turned slightly in his direction, eyes the colour of molten brass, bright but devoid of feeling, locked with his own. A chill ran through Malus, and he was unnerved to discover he could not meet Uriel's stare.
The man has dragon's eyes,
he cursed inwardly. That left him, the bastard child born of a witch. Even Uriel held more of his father's favour, or at least a surfeit of fear. Malus was simply a burden Lurhan had to bear, or so the Highborn had come to believe. It was the only explanation he could think of for why he hadn't been strangled at birth. His half-brothers and sisters seemed to sense it as well. They were all much older than he, and could have murdered him at any time. Instead, they were content to monopolize the household's wealth and leave him to wither on the vine. One of them had laid the trap at Clark-Harond. Of that, Malus was certain. He'd been a fool to think that they would be too busy with other intrigues to take an interest in his sudden absence. But how did they know he would land at the City of Ships? The question had tormented him on the long journey home. Custom and commerce required every corsair to make port at the slave tower of Karen Kar and auction his cargo to the slave lords who resided there. Avoiding the tower and sailing directly to Clark-Harond had been another rash and unorthodox act, and yet his enemies had been waiting for him.
There was even that damned letter,
he thought with disgust. Karen Kar was hundreds of leagues to the northeast, one of the most distant and isolated citadels in Nagaroth. Could a messenger have outrun the Shadowblade, riding horses to death along the coastal road as the corsair crossed first the Sea of Chill and then the Sea of Malus? Was such a thing possible? If he did learn who was responsible, what could he do about it?
Whatever I must,
he answered himself. He still had his swords and a handful of loyal highborn. It would be enough.
Let the wolves come,
he thought.
I will prepare a feast for them.
Malus of the House of Lurhan the Volcar.
The voice ground through the air, reverberating in his bones. Shaped by the power of the Drakau's armor, the voice sank into him like a slow, dull knife, reaching for his heart. At the dais, the vassal lord collapsed from his ordeal, his feet slipping in the congealing blood staining the marble steps, and tumbled bonelessly to the audience chamber's floor. His retainers moved quickly to drag him from the Drakau's presence, back to the outer court where the lesser ranks waited.
A poor showing there at the end,
Malus noted.
That will go hard on him in the year to come.
He straightened and shrugged out of his cloak, handing it to Dulfake. Like Nagaira, he wore only a lightweight chiton of human hide over black woolen robes.
Here I am, terrible one,
he said, providing the ritual response.
Your servant awaits your bidding.
Come before me and present me with your gifts.
Eyes turned his way. He could feel their hungry scrutiny. Was he predator or prey? Malus squared his shoulders and approached the dais. Knots of highborn and their retainers stood aside to allow his passage. For a brief moment he found himself face to face with Lord Korthan, one of the cabal of ambitious lords he'd convinced to invest in his raid. The Druki fixed him with a glare of pure hate, and Malus returned the stare defiantly as he slipped past. The pool of blood at the base of the dais was starting to dry, sticking to his heels as he walked through it, and ascended the steps to stand before the Drakau. The Drakau held the power of life and death over every Druki in Haggrafe. One or more lost their head at the end of every Hanelkar. Some died for crimes, others for insulting the Drakau with paltry gifts. Some died simply because the Drakau wished to demonstrate his power. 3 steps below the dais, Malus stopped, placing his neck within easy reach of the huge, curved sword.
Another year has passed in exile. Another debt of blood for the usurpers in Ulthuan.
The Drakau intoned.
We do not forgive, and we do not forget,
Malus answered.
We are the people of ice and darkness, sustained by our hate. We live for the Witch King, and to set the ancient wrongs right.
Through fire, blood, and ruin.
The Drakau loomed over him, his eyes hidden beneath the red glare seething from his visor.
The loyal vassal offers tribute to his lord. What gifts do you lay at my feet, loyal one?
The Drakau's hand tightened fractionally on the hilt of his sword. Malus met the Drakau's fiery stare with one of his own. A thought occurred to him.
Does he know of my failure? Will he seek to embarrass me before the court?
He fought down a surge of murderous rage.
Great and terrible one, all that I have is yours. My sword, my household, my hatred. They are all that I possess, and you would do well to fear them.
His defiant stare implied. For a moment, the armored figure was silent. This close, Malus could hear the Drakau's breath rumbling like bellows through the breathing slits in his helmet.
Every year the answer is the same.
The Drakau rumbled threateningly.
Other lords lay golden flesh and wondrous relics at my feet. They serve the city and the Witch King and bring torment upon our foes. Nagaroth has no place for the weak or the craven. Malus Darkblade.
A subtle tremor reverberated through the crowd. Malus stiffened at the age-old slight.
Then strike me down, terrible one,
he snarled.
Water your silvered steel with my blood, but the severed hand cannot strike at the enemy or uphold laws of the kingdom. It cannot serve the state.
Except as an example to others.
My lord and master does not lack for those, I think. But devotion is a precious thing, and the wise lord does not squander it. We Druki drink deep of the world. We stand at the edge of the outer darkness and revel in it as no one else will. We will spill oceans of blood and harvest kingdoms of souls to suit our wishes. But we do not waste things that are of use to us.
The Drakau considered Malus in silence. For the first time in his life, the Highborn sensed he rode on a razor's edge, teetering towards the abyss. Then, abruptly, the Druki overlord extended the great, taloned gauntlet.
I accept your pledge of fealty, Malus, son of Lurhan. But it is not enough to be loyal. The slave must also fear his master and know to respect the touch of the lash. Since your gifts are meager, your taste of suffering must be that much greater.
Malus gritted his teeth. With an effort of will, he forced himself to take another step towards the Drakau.
You've spared my life but named me prey before the entire court, he seethed inwardly. Well then, let's show them what manner of beast I am. Do your will, terrible one, he said.
going so far as to place his head into the Drakau's grip.
The darkness awaits, and I will learn from it,
Malus thought, his mind boiling with hate.
I will sup from it. I will fill my veins with blackest poison and sow my muscles with hate. And in time you will squirm and foul yourself and cry for mercy before me.
Consciousness flowed back like a tide, filling in the corners and crevices of his mind. He was walking, his stride numb and halting. His robes were soaked in sweat and piss and blood. The taste of blood was in his mouth, and his tongue was swollen where he had bitten into it. Crowds of people passed by on either side of him, their pale faces blurred and floating at the edges of his perception. There were shadows in his mind, receding stealthily from his consciousness, dark, cold, taloned things, ancient beyond understanding. They tantalized him and unnerved him. If he concentrated too much on the memories, he felt his tenuous hold on his body start to fray. Abruptly, he stopped. He sensed figures very close by, surrounding him on three sides. They did not touch him, offering no hand to steady him. Malus took a deep breath, and the world drew back into focus.
Did I scream?
He whispered. You made not a sound, Lunara murmured in his ear, her breath close and warm. Nor did you stumble. Malus straightened and faced the doors leading to the outer court. Distantly, he could hear Uriel's voice, addressing the Drakau in turn.
How long?
Malus asked. Lunara paused. The longest I've ever witnessed. I heard Isilvar tell one of his men that he thought you were going to die from it. The Highborn managed a wolfish grin.
Then I am pleased to disappoint once again.
His step stronger and more purposeful, Malus strode towards the great doors of blackened oak, which opened before him without the slightest sound. Beyond, the multitude of low-ranking nobles and their households waited. Their turn to face the Drakau would come, but the touch of the gauntlet was not for them. Instead, they inflicted their own forms of self-mortification, slicing and piercing their flesh to show their fealty. The air was electric with the smell of so much blood. Among the lower ranks, there was more of a festival atmosphere in the outer court, with servants carrying trays of food and wine, or suffering at the whim of their masters. Laughter, sighs of pleasure, and sharp cries of pain rose like grace notes over the general buzz of conversation. A long processional, flanked by the city guard, was cleared through the crowds, so the Highborn could come and go without hindrance. Druki nobles thronged along the aisle, watching the haunted faces of the departing Highborn and whispering in one another's ears. Malus surveyed the assembled faces with disdain, forcing his body to function as he walked the length of the processional. At the end of the line, another, smaller group of Druki waited. After a moment, Malus noticed that one of the three nobles in particular was eyeing him with considerable interest. He forced his brutalized mind to try and recognize the face, but no name came to mind. The noble was of average height and somewhat scrawny, as if the gangly time of his youth had never fully given way once he finally reached adulthood. His head was shaved except for a corsair's topknot, and rings of silver glittered from his pointed ears. His narrow chin was shadowed with a thin goatee, and his dark eyes were wide with excitement and glittering with hidden knowledge.
Who does this fool think he is?
Malus frowned. The Druki's robes and chitin were of some quality, but had a rustic cut, the leather reaching nearly to the man's knees. The dark red hide was worked with a sigil of a mountain peak. Malus stopped cold.
Furlan. Of course! Well met, my lord,
Furlan said unctuously, bowing low. Before Malus could respond, the Nagarite rushed up to him, ignoring any pretense of propriety. His 2 men, evidently local knights with no other prospects, or possible mercenaries, followed reluctantly in their master's wake. Lunara hissed threateningly, but Malus stayed her with a slight wave of the hand.
Did my lord receive the letter?
Furlan asked quietly.
I went to no small expense to deliver it to Clark Harond ahead of your arrival.
Malus studied the Nagarite hostage carefully. His presence at court was meant to ensure the peace between Hag Grafe and Nagor, a recent development after decades of bitter and bloody feuds. As such, the fool enjoyed a degree of protection few others at court did. Caution warred with black rage in Malus's heart.
Oh, yes, I received it,
he said coldly.
Excellent.
Furlan leaned closer, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone.
There is much to discuss, Dread Lord. As you know, I've been among the court and your kinfolk for some time, and
he attempted a self-effacing smile.
I flatter myself that I have some skill at the art of intrigue. I have learned of some things, some very interesting things, that I think you would find of import.
Furlan laid a hand on the highborn's arm.
There is much we could both profit from if we were to form an alliance of equals.
Malus's left hand closed around Furlan's throat in a blur of deadly motion. The Nagarite paled, his eyes bulging. One of his retainers rushed forward with a shout, reaching for Malus's wrist, but Lunara's sword sang through the air, severing the knight's head in a fountain of gore. Furlan's second retainer staggered back, raising his hand in surrender, and then fading quickly into the crowd.
Oh yes, Furlan. You and I have some things to discuss,
Malus hissed, tightening his grip. Furlan's face was now turning a pale shade of red, his hands scrabbling futilely at the highborn's iron grip.
After I've flayed your skin from your scabby chest and flensed the muscles away with fine, sharp knives, after I've spread your ribs and shown you your shriveled organs, after I've reshaped that pitiful face with my hooks and barbs and worn it before you like a mask, then you will tell me how you knew when and where I would return to Nagaroth. You will tell me who gave you that information and why. You will tell me everything. And then you will pray through ragged lips that I forbear showing you just how deep the darkness in me truly goes. No one knows,
Malus thought savagely.
But oh, I will show them.